Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Continuing this week's theme of focusing on U.S. foreign and national security policy, we are following up Tuesday's episode with Dmitry Perovich that covered the possibility of an invasion of Taiwan, with an episode with the New York Times' David E. Sanger to discuss his new book, New Cold Wars. New Cold Wars is the best book I've read in the past few years on this broad subject of what the 21st century looks like from a geopolitical perspective. He goes through every single part of the globe, Europe, the Middle East, the Indo-Pacific, and focuses on how these challenges both relate to America's foreign policy, but how it's actually going to change the domestic political reality, economically and otherwise, in this country itself. It's hard to kind of merge the reporting perspective with the deep ideas analytical perspective, but David does an amazing job, and I just got so much from this book that I cannot recommend enough. Hope you all enjoy this conversation. Huge thank you to the Foundation for American Innovation for supporting the work of this podcast. David Sanger, welcome to the Realignment.
Great to be with you, Marshall.
We were joking before the episode. There have been a bunch of contributions to this state of U.S. foreign policy inside the baseball, Joe Biden administration to Trump transition period. Your book, though, is unique in your framing specifically about new Cold Wars. Not one Cold War, not Cold War 2.0, not Cold War II, new Cold Wars. Explain why you're framing the current geopolitical moment along those lines.
Well, it's not the favorite wording, I can tell you, of the Biden administration. President Biden went to the United Nations for his first speech in 2021, after he was inaugurated, and said, I am not seeking a new Cold War. What I argue in the book is, seeking it or not, he finds himself in two. And obviously, one of them is the effort to contain Russia from its ability to disrupt. And the second, far more complicated one, is the effort to contain China as it tries to build the elements it needs to become the dominant, and this is their stated phrase, not mine, the dominant military, political, technological, economic power by 2049, which will be the 100th anniversary of Mao's creation of the People's Republic. The thread that runs through the whole book, of course, is after you get through 150 pages of how we deceived ourselves into thinking that Russia and China, for their own reasons, were going to join the Western economy under Western rules and Western legal norms and so forth. The core of the book is really about the effort of Russia and China to, at moments, come together and try to do exactly what Nixon and Kissinger were trying to prevent in the early 70s when they did the opening to China and tried to keep Russia and China from combining. I do not describe this in the book as an easy partnership, certainly not as an alliance, but as one that at various moments will be enormously useful to each of them.
How sustainable is a Russia-China partnership? It seems that on the timeline that we're focused on here, obviously the war in Ukraine, and then obviously the prospect of a Chinese seizure of Taiwan, it seems pretty sustainable because the core question is really to the degree with which they could orient themselves against the United States, and any sort of border disputes or resource conflicts are going to be less important than they ultimately were important during the 60s and 70s. How would you kind of answer that question?
I think it's increasingly important to both of them for different reasons. Putin needs allies and friends, but he needs technology, right? And this week, Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, is going to China, part of this effort to try to rebuild the relationship some after the meeting in Riverside, California, between President Xi and President Biden last Thanksgiving. But increasingly, there is evidence of the Chinese providing that technology that Russia has been starved of for so long. And I think it's going to be a pretty delicate act because, look, the Chinese can say, excuse me, who is giving technology to the Ukrainians here? You are, and not just, chips and components, but intelligence. And always get at this. Chapter 19 of the book describes in great length what we have done in testing out Project Maven, the project that initially sent the Google campus into rebellion. It has come back as a way to help the Ukrainians find and target Russians. So it's not going to be an easy argument that Blinken's going to have to make. And this is so symbolic of the age. There was something predictable about the old Cold War, the singular one. It was primarily a military competition. Mm-hmm. Within that, it was primarily a nuclear competition. We knew who had launch authority. They had a red phone on their desk. We had a red phone on our desk. We all had means of sort of slowing things down and so forth. And now we're in a world that is so much more complicated, that you've got Russia, China, Iran, to some degree, North Korea, the country that could never find friends, linked up together. You have countries that are economically or technologically dependent on China, whether they are in the South China Sea or the Pacific Islands or Africa or the Middle East. You have the U.S. trying to head them off at every step. That's what the deal between Microsoft and the UAE was about last week. A business deal that was basically hatched in the White House. So we wrote about it, their investment in G42, an artificial intelligence company. So this is so much more complicated. There's no red phone to keep on the desk. There's no small set of players that you can go call.
And you can't just reduce the state of the war down to what are the number of nuclear weapons on either side, what do the delivery devices look like, because it's much more full spectrum than that. So here's a question, especially the younger listeners who are particularly engaged with the 2000s, they're going to hear talk of an alliance, an axis, a relationship between Russia, Iran, China, North Korea, and just also bring to mind the axis of evil speech, which as an analytical framework wasn't particularly coherent. And I think in many ways distracted the United States from the challenges and opportunities of the post 9/11 moment. To what degree do you think we should use or be comfortable with references to an axis, to an alliance across these countries, merely because they're sharing technology and constructing things for each other? How should we think about this?
I don't think we should frame it. I think we let them frame it. And it's really the Iranians who have used the axis of resistance phraseology to describe countries that are coming together to resist American influence. And it's much broader than just China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. But it is worth thinking about what the long-term costs involved are in having a world in which we are once again creating iron curtains, one along the southern and eastern border of Ukraine, where we're trying to figure out where's the dividing line between where Ukraine ends and Russia begins. And can any of that, in the end up in Russian hands, which the Ukrainians say no. And I think many in the United States say, well, it'd be nice if the Russians didn't get any land out of this adventure, but do you want a war going on forever? What does Ukraine really need to survive it as a state? But you're also seeing it in the Pacific, where the Chinese are trying to push the United States back to the second island chain. They want a zone of influence. They're deeply interested in the Monroe Doctrine, as we declared it, because they think it would fit their situation as well. And then we've got the beyond Ukraine questions, which is, how are we obligated to defend Taiwan to the same degree that we would defend a NATO state? When President Biden declared 3 or 4 times that we would send troops in the defense of Taiwan, did he mean it? If the Chinese are preparing for that day by salting our water pipelines and our utility grid, with malware that could be activated to slow down a response to a Taiwan incident or create such chaos in the United States that Americans turn inward, which they want to do these days anyway, and worry about their own water supplies and their own keeping the refrigerators on. Would that do the trick to keep us out? These are all really big strategic questions that in a previous era, I think this presidential campaign would be all about. You go back and you listen to, try this, Marshall, sometimes. Just listen to the audio of the Nixon-Kennedy debates so that out of your mind is who looks younger, is Nixon sweating? I mean, all the, all the side stuff that the politicos love. And ask yourself the question, could we have a strategic debate today as sophisticated as the one that Nixon and Kennedy were conducting in those debates about deterrence, about the right level of nuclear weapons, about missile gaps, whether they existed or not? I think the answer is that about 10 minutes in, you'd say, there's no way the American people would sit still today for a discussion like that, in part because for 30 years, we've had a sort of geopolitical holiday. Mm-hmm.
I think the real question for you is, I'm looking at the Trump presidency and the Biden presidency, and having just read the book, I'll go very specific at this. You've hinted at a dynamic in the Biden administration where you and I could do a version of this podcast and say that, look, Joe Biden has oriented the Democratic Party. Joe Biden, Jake Sullivan, Antony Blinken, et cetera, have oriented the Democratic Party away from the Obama consensus on foreign policy. In some ways, they've adopted arguments, specific policies that the Trump administration has adopted. They are seeing China in a totally different light than their predecessors. But at multiple points in the book, you hinted the fact that if you actually speak to high up officials in the Biden administration, and I'd say probably the broader NGO apparatus that undergirds the Democratic Party and the center left, and there actually isn't consensus on these issues in the same way, in a way that's different than the Trump era, because obviously there's all sorts of, strum and dung around Trump in the Republican Party, but actually most Republicans at an institutional level are with him on the China questions. Where is the post-Biden Democratic Party circa 2025 if he wins re-election and everyone and their cousins running for the presidential primary?
So a really good question. Look, the Republican splits here are easy to see, and all you need to do is run down the roll call of the vote over the weekend on Ukraine aid, and you can see those who believe in a traditional Republican internationalist view that the United States has got to be out there funding nascent or threatened democracies and all that. And that's what the bill's about, right? I mean, yes, a lot of the Ukraine money goes to rebuilding our weapon stockpiles here at home, but if you put together a bill that's about Ukraine, Taiwan, to some degree, Israel and Gaza, and along the way bans TikTok, you've got the sort of full spectrum national security bill, right? Mm-hmm. And you've had a number of Republicans vote against it. The Democrats are split on the question of Israel and Gaza, obviously, but also on the question of, hey, what happened to our peace dividend? Weren't we supposed to be spending the money that we're putting into the Pentagon on early childhood education? Aren't we supposed to be spending it on public health and getting ready for the next coronavirus? And that's the fundamental battle inside the Democratic Party. They're not having it in public right now because they're lining up behind a pretty traditional institutionalist view taken by Biden himself.
Yeah, and I think that given that all of the American political system is oriented around Donald Trump, the fact that Trump is very concertedly on the opposite end of a bunch of those debate issues just make it easier for the Democrats to really coalesce. That's why I'm just fascinated by 2025 if Biden wins re-election. What does it look like to have these? Because once again, there's just a way of, let me just put it this way. I do not think the Biden-China consensus is as strong as it looks if you just look at the top of administration perspectives here. Here's another question I'm curious about. You don't focus on John Kerry and John Kerry's efforts around climate change vis-a-vis China in the book. And I think that's another interesting, if John Kerry were, I think, younger and more relevant in his political career, that would have been a bigger issue. AKA this idea of like, wait a second, Joe Biden, the hostile relationship we're developing with China is preventing us from working on the big issue of our time, aka climate change. John Kerry didn't have the ability to build a constituency around that issue. And I think just like the stakes of the questions just were so overwhelming, it was too much. Maybe if maybe if COVID hadn't happened, this would have been easier for him. But where do you kind of think about the John Kerry wing of the State Department, those sort of issues?
So listen, I covered Kerry when he was Secretary of State, and flew around the world with him doing the Iran negotiations. Think of the very different era that was, where the US, the Russians, and the Chinese were on the same side of the negotiating table, and the Iranians on the other side. The Europeans obviously were along with the US. Imagine today that we stitch together the Iran negotiations again to try to limit their nuclear program. What side of the table do you think the Chinese and the Russians, particularly the Russians as they bring in Iranian drones, are sitting on? The fact that we were on the same side of the table in the Obama era meant that people could sit together and talk about other issues. There was a moment when the Iranians seized a bunch of American sailors who had drifted into Iranian territory. Kerry and the then Iranian foreign minister managed to get them back out within hours. Today it would be a hostage crisis. The Obama administration managed to have a climate accord with the Chinese. You can argue about the details and whether they got enough out of the Chinese or not, but they were able to meet president to president and actually get it done. So the world that John Kerry was trying to go deal with during the Biden period was he was trying to get a climate agreement together with China at a moment that we were cutting off the chips and the semiconductor production equipment to go make them, that they viewed as the ultimate containment of their economic power. That's not Kerry's fault, right? It's just that he had no reservoir of goodwill there.
No, and I think that's a fascinating, and even I think that in of itself, I think, is a fascinating core theme of the book, which is that it's a cliche to say the world changed so much during the Trump years, but in the categories that you're writing and we're really discussing, that 2015 world feels like 50 years ago in terms of how just incoherently disparate it is from our lived reality here.
Well, Marshall, that's part of why I wrote the book, because that seems 15 years ago. What about the era when George Bush is floating down the Neva River with Putin and they're talking about Russia joining the European Union and maybe one day joining NATO? What about the days when there was a Russia-NATO council whose office was inside the barbed wire of the NATO headquarters? I mean, Bush and Putin met 25, 26 times, sort of depending on how you count what constitutes a separate meeting. You know how many times Biden has met Putin in person since they've been president?
Zero? One time? Okay.
Geneva, 2021, for the meeting that was largely about ransomware. We're not allowed to bet online here, Marshall, but if we were, I might be willing to stake a few beers with you about whether or not they will ever meet again as presidents. I don't think they ever will, whether Biden's reelected or not reelected.
Hey, it's Marshall. In an exponential era, it's more important than ever for our country to have alignment between policymakers, founders, and funders. However, it's rare that we find all of them in the same room. Luckily, the A16Z podcast from Andreessen Horowitz just dropped a brand new series on American dynamism focused on exactly this. Coined by Realignment friend and A16Z general partner Catherine Boyle, American dynamism is a movement that embodies the spirit of innovation, and this new 4-part series, recorded in the heart of Washington, D.C., covers topics including intelligence in the era of AI, the nuclear renaissance, and the future of defense. Guests include the CIA's first ever Chief Technology Officer, Nand Mulchandani, the Department of Energy's Assistant Secretary for Nuclear Energy, Dr. Catherine Huff, and Director of the DoD's Defense Innovation Unit, Doug Beck. Not to mention the founders of ambitious companies rivaling the status quo, like microreactor company Radiant, AI pilot company Shield AI, and advanced autonomous systems company Anduril. So don't miss out. Go check out the A16Z podcast and their new series on American dynamism on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening now. A real theme here, too, then, is the United States confronts a radically different world from even a decade or even 2 decades ago. When you're reading the book, we're going from the Middle East to Taiwan to the halls of power in DC to Moscow to Russia to Europe, et cetera. It's really a book that I'd recommend for anyone in the public policy space who's trying to just get a good read on where everything stands. What is your degree of confidence that the U.S. has not just like the moral capacity, but the literal capacity to address all these challenges? Because I think for a lot of folks, what's particularly jarring about the war in Ukraine and the prospects of deterring China and Taiwan is that we'll have a conversation. And it's not, do we defend Taiwan or not? It's, hey, like, do we have the defense industrial base that's literally capable of supporting both the Ukrainians and the Taiwanese at the same time? It's an era of limits that I don't think has been valid in my lifetime. And that seems to be such a headspace shift for folks. Like, how do you think about that?
It absolutely is a headspace shift. And there was a headspace shift for me. Look, as you've identified, this is a book of reporting, right? I traveled around the world for this, as did my main researcher and co-author in parts of this, Mary Brooks. And, you know, we went to Taiwan Semiconductor to examine the question of whether or not there is a silicon shield. In other words, whether the Chinese would conclude that the risk of losing Taiwan Semiconductor was so great to their economy as well as to ours that it would not be worth doing the invasion. By the way, I concluded it is an eroding shield. It will not last anywhere near as long as I think we are hoping it would. We went to go to the countries like India that say, don't make us choose between these two sides. But as Gina Raimondo, the Commerce Secretary, who's a surprisingly large player in this tale because she's the one who's negotiating the limits on semiconductor exports to China and semiconductor equipment exports, but also trying to fuel the industrial policy to build up the U.S. capability. As she said, when it comes to advanced technology, you can't be in the American camp and the China camp. Yes, you have to choose, which is something most countries basically are fundamentally rejecting, having to go do right now. So we are in a strikingly different world, and it is a world of limits.
So
the
here's another
biggest surprise to American officials was that we could not just flip on the arsenal of democracy and churn out 155 millimeter and artillery ammunition for the Ukrainians. We didn't have the capacity. It had eroded away. The Europeans had less. Had it not been for Rheinmetall, a German firm that is just now getting going on the production, they would have almost nothing, no German capacity to build this at all. And then, of course, there are all the new technologies that we have to think about. What do we want to hold on to, and what do we want to test out in Ukraine?
You know, speaking of Ukraine, and by the way, I appreciate how we're doing this interview because we're just sort of traveling around the various hotspots and theaters that you're covering. Speaking of Ukraine, I have noticed a theme. I interviewed Franklin Foer about his profile of the Biden administration. And then I obviously read your book and a couple other ones that this is like an intuition I've taken on that's gotten me in trouble at a couple of dinner parties. So I'd like to try it on for you. I have come away from this book very frustrated with President Zelensky's inability to grow as a politician beyond his role of February 2022 to May 2022, when at a core level, his job is staying in Kyiv, not leaving, remaining strong in the face of, frankly, mortal challenges that I think there are few, if any, leaders worldwide who'd be ready to handle it the way he did. But since then, I think his treatment of President Biden on the phone, I think the inability to convey gratitude in the political sense has been very, very disconcerting. And you write about some of these kind of like anecdotes, but I think that's just sort of a frustration I had. And I've seen this not just in your book, but in other books as well. I'd like for you to kind of offer your evaluation of President Zelensky within the context I set up, if I'm not being too unfair.
No. Well, so I actually think it's improving with Zelensky, that it was worse in the first year. And that was because he was trying to preserve his country. He was asking for the moon, and he wasn't, and the stars, and he was getting, a fraction of what he was asking for. And his relationship with Biden at first was very transactional. I need 100 HIMARS. I'm making up the numbers here, but I need X number of artillery shells. He would send generals in with asks for amounts of ammunition that go beyond what was in all of the American stockpiles everywhere in the world. So he was out of touch with the reality of what we could go do. And by the summer of 2023, Biden had sort of had it up to here with him. And they finally ended up sending the American ambassador in Kyiv over to see Zelensky a day or so before any meeting he was going to have by telecom with the president or see him in person, and say, here's how you do a presidential meeting. You agree on broad principles, and you let your staff out there haggle out the details. And this was to avoid Biden just blowing his top on all of this. Zelensky, to his credit, is, he was an actor, and he picks it up quick and learns the lines. And I actually think he's doing much better now in that regard. Whether he's also testing the limits of the Ukrainians about, with his constant effort to drive them to send more and more of their young male population to war, that's another issue.
Yeah, and the reason why I ask you that question, I'm very pro-Ukraine, is just that this brings to mind another anecdote from the book. You quote the Chinese ambassador to the U.S. As saying, look, I've paraphrased, but I've spoken to the smartest people, I've spoken to the experts, and they basically say they don't understand what's happening in the United States right now. So the worry that I have with our allies and our quasi-allies is that the American political scene right now is so complicated that I'm desperately worried that they don't have the means or the ability to understand and interpret accordingly. So, for example, I can tell you as someone who does a lot of surveying of the American right, especially on the foreign policy side of things, Zelensky's performances with Joe Biden, obviously the right doesn't care about Joe Biden, but the categories of mistakes he was making, I think in his presentation, in his framing, in the asks he was making, I think very directly polarized a debate, which is kind of like bad faith, but I still think polarized it in the wrong direction. So I think and then once again, that's just my personal perspective as someone who surveys the American right. But my question is really just getting at any world leader today has to understand an incredibly complicated, changing United States. To what degree do you think the Ukrainians, the Taiwanese, the Chinese, et cetera, have the ability to comprehend a country that, frankly, our politicians don't really comprehend either?
I was about to say, if they can comprehend it, would they please go explain it to me? Because, so
your email is open if anyone wants to reach out to you about
that. It's confusing, and partly it's confusing because it is not stable. Remember, when Zelensky first came to Congress, he spoke to a joint group session of Congress. He got pretty much unanimous applause, right? Even the group that we now think of as deeply conservative Republicans who wanted to cut off the money and just lost in the most recent vote, they were on their feet applauding his lines about preserving liberty and the territorial integrity of Ukraine. The second time he came, 6 months later, the speaker, who I think at the time was still Kevin McCarthy, couldn't even put him up in front of a joint session of Congress because they were afraid he'd be booed by that group of Republicans. And so they ended up meeting some hand-selected Republicans and Democrats down at the National Archive so they wouldn't have the embarrassment of doing this on TV in front of Congress. Now, is that Zelensky's fault? I mean, the guy's got a busy day, right? He's trying to keep his country from getting overrun. Or is that our fault for not having a constancy of a bipartisan national security policy here? And, it gets back to what I was saying before about the Kennedy-Nixon debates, because, they differed about how much you spend and what the nature of the threat was. But by reference to today, there was much more confluence of understanding of the threat than there is today.
Okay, so in these last 8 to 10 minutes, because we've jumped around a bit, I want to very much sum things up. So the way I understand this and the way I think my audience should understand this is we are clearly in the middle of a real transition of the United States' foreign policy and a foreign policy that in many ways involves domestic politics in a way that, frankly, 9/11 and the post-9/11 era in terms of didn't really involve. So obviously there's privacy and surveillance issues, but one of the critical issues during the 9/11 era was that there was a divorce between, let's say, the debate about the surge in Iraq or Afghan policy circa 2011 and what was happening domestically. In this case, we're doing mass industrial policy for reasons that tie directly to our foreign policy orientation in the Indo-Pacific. So can you really just offer because once again, this is a reporting book, this isn't a policy book, but I would just love for you to kind of offer advice for how policymakers and young people who are in the middle of this transition how should one orient oneself? Like what areas that you're particularly engaged on should you be engaging in, wherever you want to take it?
Sure. So the first is, if you're thinking about the difference between the old Cold War and the new, this is much more of a technology struggle. The old one, if it was primarily military, I would say the competition here is primarily technological. Within that, you have to think about which of those technologies we really need to retain American power and American influence, and which ones we don't. Some are no-brainers. If you're not making your own semiconductors and you're vulnerable to being cut off, if you're not thinking about those in national security terms, you're probably not analyzing the problem right. And yet, I can't tell you how many members of Congress I've had this discussion with. I've said, look, do you know what the last aircraft carrier was that we built? Was the Gerald R. Ford. Cost about, Marshall, plus or minus $15 billion after the usual cost overruns and everything else. Okay. Let's say you ask Congress right now, because of the competition with China, for authorization to build 10 new aircraft carriers. Now, I'd argue that the last thing you want to have in an era of asymmetric weapons, they're giant sitting ducks. But let's set that aside. Many in Congress have said to me, you could get the $150 to $200 billion for 10 new aircraft carriers after a couple of weeks of debate. That number is interesting, the $15 billion, because it's about what it costs you to build a new semiconductor fab that would be useful in the United States for domestic commercial production, for military, for intelligence use, for space. If you said we need to keep up with China, government funding for another 10 semiconductor fabs, people would immediately turn to you and say that's industrial policy. We are getting ahead of the market. We have to let the market produce this. That is an old think way of approaching what is your national security vulnerability and what is not. And being dependent on either Taiwan and an ally that is 100 miles from the Chinese coast and vulnerable, or on China, an adversary that can turn this on and off. Same thing for rare earths and so forth. It seems pretty clear to me that we need a new way of thinking about how to frame the problem.
And to pause you there real quick, and this is where I think some of the Bidenomics and internal discussions with the administration have confused the messaging here. I think a lot of Republicans and conservatives and libertarians who are really repelled by industrial policy primarily think of it through the lens of a jobs program. So they think of industrial policy through the lens of this very 1980s, like 1990s, almost Ross Perot style debate about manufacturing jobs in the United States. And I think Joe Biden, when he's telling the Bidenomics story, frames it along those lines. And that domestic manufacturing jobs argument is actually very different than the domestic resiliency, national security lens here. And I think there's a real need for the administration moving forward to find a way, if they're looking to win over more Republicans, or actually just build a more durable consensus, to actually make clear these are actually two different arguments. Because I think I think there's a real confusion when I speak to people on the right who are repelled by industrial policy. They think Joe Biden's just trying to do a jobs program. And it's like, no, like that's not the actual purpose. Like that's a nice benefit, but this isn't going to bring back manufacturing from the 50s. And the people in the policy areas don't believe they're trying to do that.
Yeah. Look, it'll bring back a surge of jobs at the beginning. Building a semiconductor fab is very labor intensive with old time building skills, right? Mm. You need huge amounts of water being pumped into these. You need huge amounts of electricity. You need serious infrastructure, and it's being done by plumbers and workers and all that. And so that's the first thing you hear out of Biden's mouth when he shows up in Phoenix, as he did the other day, to celebrate Taiwan Semiconductor building a new fab in the United States. But the temptation of the quick political win for that is so great that you may lose teaching Americans about the broader strategy here. The book describes a real strategy on the part of the Biden team, a strategy of gaining time by depriving the Chinese of some key technologies. The most interesting story is about ASML, the Netherlands company that makes the machinery that sits at the middle of a semiconductor fab, and getting the then Prime Minister of the Netherlands, Rutte, who's likely to become the next head of NATO, to cut off the Chinese. A huge political problem for him in the Netherlands, not the world's biggest economy. And he's being told that one of the best customers has got to go away. Those are all the really hard decisions of what technologies do you need to consider strategic and which ones do you not. And he's not having that conversation in public. Now, his own people would say, look, we don't live in a nation of specialists. They're not going to know an ASML semiconductor manufacturing machinery, even if they saw pictures of it. So you've got to get them behind the concept of bringing jobs and security at home. But the lesson of the pandemic was supply chains matter. And the lesson of the Taiwan conflict is there's a reason that the Chinese are putting malware in our water systems and our electric grid and all that, the program known as Typhoon. It's to slow down our response the day that they decide they really are going to move in on Taiwan or slowly choke it off. And the president does not do a very comprehensive job of describing those sets of threats. Maybe he doesn't want to scare everybody. I get that. Maybe he thinks this is the kind of thing that's best done quietly with allies. My own view is you have to prepare the American people for what an era of new Cold Wars looks like. And that's really what the book's about.
That is the perfect place to end. David, thank you so much for joining me on The Realignment.
Thank you, Marshall. Great to be with you.